The Romans had gods. These gods were part of Roman life. People acknowledged them. They made offerings to them. They told stories about them. The gods explained aspects of the world. They provided structure to religious practice. They were simply there, part of the background of existence. Jupiter. Jupiter was the king of the gods. This was his role. He was associated with the sky and with weather. Thunder and lightning were his domain. When storms came, they came from Jupiter. This is what people believed. Jupiter had temples. The largest was on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. This temple was important. Officials made offerings there. Triumphs, military victory parades, ended at this temple. The god was honored in this way. The temple stood as a physical reminder of Jupiter's presence and importance. Jupiter was married to Juno. This was known. Their relationship was part of the stories about them. Jupiter had other relationships as well. He was interested in various goddesses and mortal women. These relationships produced children. Many gods and heroes claimed Jupiter as their father. This was a common element in the stories. People prayed to Jupiter for protection. They asked for favorable weather. They asked for success in important endeavors. Jupiter was powerful. He could grant or withhold these things. Therefore, it made sense to ask him. The asking took the form of prayers and offerings. An offering might be an animal sacrifice. It might be wine poured on an altar. It might be incense burned. The form varied, but the purpose was the same: to gain Jupiter's favor. Jupiter was depicted in art and statues. He was shown as a mature man with a beard. He often held a thunderbolt. Sometimes an eagle was near him. The eagle was his sacred bird. These images were consistent. When people saw such an image, they recognized Jupiter. The recognition was immediate and required no explanation. Juno. Juno was Jupiter's wife. She was queen of the gods. This was her position. She was associated with marriage and childbirth. Women prayed to her especially. She protected women. She oversaw the transitions in women's lives: marriage, pregnancy, birth. These were significant moments. Having divine protection for them seemed important. Juno had her own temples. Women visited these temples. They made offerings. They asked for Juno's help. A woman hoping to become pregnant might pray to Juno. A woman in childbirth might call on Juno. These practices were normal. They were what one did. In the stories, Juno was often aware of Jupiter's other relationships. She knew about them. This knowledge did not please her. Some stories describe her responses to these situations. She might make things difficult for Jupiter's other partners. She might send troubles their way. The stories present this as natural behavior for a wife in her position. The Romans, hearing these stories, found them understandable. Gods had personalities and emotions, just as humans did. Juno was depicted as a dignified woman. She wore royal garments. Sometimes a crown or diadem was on her head. Sometimes a peacock was shown with her. The peacock was her sacred bird. The images conveyed her status and authority. She was not subordinate, despite being married to the king of gods. She had her own power and domain. Mars. Mars was the god of war. This was his primary association. War was important to Rome. Rome engaged in military campaigns regularly. Having a god who presided over war made sense. Mars was that god. Mars was also associated with agriculture. This seems contradictory. War and farming appear to be different activities. But in Roman culture, they were connected. Farmers became soldiers when needed. Soldiers returned to farming when campaigns ended. Mars oversaw both activities. This dual role was accepted. It was not considered strange. The month of March was named for Mars. March was when the military campaign season traditionally began. Winter was over. Roads were passable. Armies could move. Therefore, military activity resumed in March. The month belonging to Mars reflected this timing. Mars had temples in Rome. The Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, was named for him. This was an open area where military exercises occurred. Young men trained there. They practiced with weapons. They engaged in athletic activities that prepared them for warfare. The space was dedicated to Mars. His presence was invoked in the activities that occurred there. Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, according to Roman tradition. Romulus founded Rome. Therefore, Mars was connected to Rome's origins. This gave him special importance in Roman religion. He was not just any god, he was Rome's patron in a particular way. His relationship to the city's founding was foundational. In art, Mars was shown as a warrior. He wore armor. He carried a spear and shield. Sometimes a helmet was on his head. The imagery was straightforward. Mars was war. The images reflected this directly. Venus. Venus was the goddess of love. She was also associated with beauty and desire. These were her domains. When people experienced romantic love, that was Venus's influence. When they found someone beautiful, that was Venus at work. This is how her role was understood. Venus was important to Rome because of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan hero who, according to legend, came to Italy after Troy fell. He was the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. Venus was Aeneas's mother. Therefore, Venus was the ancestral goddess of the Roman people. Julius Caesar's family claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas. This made Venus politically important to that family and to Rome. Venus had temples. Offerings were made to her. People asked for success in love. They asked for beauty. They asked for the favor that Venus could provide. The requests were personal. They concerned relationships and attraction. These were matters that affected people's lives significantly. The planet Venus was associated with the goddess. The planet was visible in the morning or evening sky. It was bright. This brightness connected to the goddess's nature. She was radiant. She inspired desire. The planet's visibility made it a natural symbol for her. In art, Venus was depicted as a beautiful woman. She was often shown partially unclothed or emerging from water. The story of her birth involved her arising from sea foam. This origin story explained certain aspects of her nature: water, beauty, birth. These elements combined in her mythology. Venus was married to Vulcan, the god of fire and metalworking. However, she had a relationship with Mars. This relationship was known. Stories were told about it. Vulcan discovered the relationship. He trapped Venus and Mars in a net he had made. He displayed them to the other gods. This was embarrassing for Venus and Mars, but the relationship continued nonetheless, according to the stories. The gods had their affairs and complications, just as humans did. Neptune was the god of the sea. The sea was his realm. He controlled it. Sailors prayed to Neptune for safe voyages. They made offerings to him before setting out. They thanked him when they returned safely. The sea was dangerous. Having divine protection seemed necessary. Neptune was one of Jupiter's brothers. After the Titans were defeated, the world was divided among three brothers. Jupiter received the sky, Neptune received the sea, Pluto received the underworld. This division was permanent. Each brother ruled his domain. They did not interfere with each other's territories, generally. Neptune carried a trident. This was his symbol. A trident is a three-pronged spear. It was associated with fishing and the sea. When Neptune was depicted, the trident was present. This made him immediately recognizable. Neptune could cause earthquakes. The Romans believed earthquakes came from Neptune. He struck the ground with his trident, and the earth shook. This explanation for earthquakes was accepted. It provided a cause for something that seemed inexplicable otherwise. Neptune had temples near the sea. Coastal communities especially honored him. Their livelihoods depended on the sea. Fishing, trade, naval power, all required Neptune's favor. Therefore, his worship was important in those places. Horse races were sometimes held in Neptune's honor. Horses were sacred to Neptune. This association came from Greek tradition, where Poseidon, the Greek equivalent of Neptune, was connected to horses. Romans adopted this connection. Therefore, equestrian events honored Neptune. Minerva. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom. She was also associated with crafts and warfare. These three elements, wisdom, craft, and strategic warfare, were her domains. She was not martial in the way Mars was. Mars represented the violence of battle. Minerva represented the strategy and intelligence required for successful warfare. Minerva was a virgin goddess. She did not marry. She did not have romantic relationships. This was part of her nature. Her focus was on intellectual and practical pursuits, not on domestic or romantic matters. Craftspeople honored Minerva. Those who worked with their hands and their minds, weavers, potters, metalworkers, sought her blessing. Skill in craft was a gift from Minerva. Excellence in these areas meant one had Minerva's favor. Minerva was part of the Capitoline Triad. This was a group of three gods worshipped together in the main temple on the Capitoline Hill: Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. These three were central to Roman state religion. Their importance was official and recognized. In art, Minerva wore armor. She carried a spear and shield. Often an owl was with her. The owl represented wisdom. Its ability to see in the dark symbolized the clarity of wisdom that sees through confusion. The imagery was consistent and meaningful. Mercury was the messenger of the gods. He carried messages between the gods. He also carried messages between gods and humans. This was his function. He moved quickly. He had winged sandals that allowed him to fly. This speed was necessary for his role. Mercury was also the god of commerce and travelers. Merchants prayed to Mercury. So did people undertaking journeys. The connection was his association with movement and communication. Trade required both. Travel required both. Therefore, Mercury was the appropriate god for these activities. Mercury was clever. Stories depicted him as intelligent and sometimes tricky. He used his wit to solve problems or to gain advantages. This cleverness was part of his character. It was admired. Intelligence was valuable. The planet Mercury was named for the god. The planet moved quickly across the sky. This speed matched the god's nature. The connection was natural and obvious. In art, Mercury had his winged sandals. He often held a staff called a caduceus. The caduceus had two snakes wound around it. This staff was his symbol. When someone saw this image, they knew it represented Mercury. Vesta and the household gods. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth. The hearth was the center of the home. It provided warmth and a place to cook. Vesta protected the hearth. By extension, she protected the home itself. Every household honored Vesta. Her presence was constant and necessary. In Rome, Vesta had a temple where a sacred fire burned. This fire was tended by the Vestal virgins. These were priestesses dedicated to Vesta's service. They maintained the fire continuously. If it went out, this was a bad sign. It suggested divine disfavor. Therefore, great care was taken to keep it burning. The Vestal virgins served for 30 years. They took vows of chastity. Breaking this vow was a serious offense. The punishment was severe. But most Vestals fulfilled their duties without incident. They were respected members of society. Their role was important. Every household also had its own gods. These were the Lares and Penates. The Lares were guardian spirits of the household. They protected the family and the home. The Penates were spirits of the storeroom. They protected the food supply. Both were honored regularly. Small shrines existed in homes. These shrines were called Lararia. They held images or statues of the Lares and Penates. Daily offerings were made at these shrines. The offerings were simple: a bit of food, some wine, incense. The practice took only a moment. But it was done consistently. It maintained the relationship between the family and their protective spirits. These household gods were personal. They were specific to each family. They were not the great gods of state religion, but they were important in daily life. They were closer, more immediate. A person interacted with the household gods every day. The great gods were more distant. Both had their place in Roman religious life. Pluto and the underworld. Pluto was the god of the underworld. The underworld was where the dead went. All the dead went there, good and bad alike. It was not a place of punishment for most. It was simply where one existed after death. Pluto ruled this realm. Pluto was also called Dis. This was another name for the same god. The underworld was sometimes called Orcus. The names varied, but the concept was consistent. There was a place below. The dead resided there. A god ruled it. People feared Pluto somewhat. He represented death. Death was inevitable, but it was not welcomed. Therefore, Pluto was respected, but not loved. People did not make many offerings to him. To do so seemed to invite his attention. It was better to focus on gods associated with life and prosperity. Pluto had a wife. She was Proserpina. Her story was similar to the Greek story of Persephone. She was taken to the underworld to be Pluto's wife. Her mother searched for her. Eventually, an arrangement was made. Proserpina spent part of the year in the underworld and part above ground. This explained the seasons, as her mother's grief during the underground period caused winter. The underworld had a guardian. This was Cerberus, a three-headed dog. Cerberus prevented the dead from leaving the underworld. He stood at the entrance. His multiple heads allowed him to watch in all directions. No dead spirit could slip past him. This ensured that the boundary between the living and dead remained intact. When someone died, their family performed rituals. These rituals ensured the deceased would be properly received in the underworld. Coins were placed on the eyes or in the mouth of the dead. These coins paid the ferryman, Charon, who transported souls across the river Styx. Without payment, a soul could not cross. It would wander. This was undesirable. Therefore, the coins were important. Diana. Diana was the goddess of the hunt. She was also associated with the moon. She protected wild animals, even as she presided over hunting them. This seeming contradiction was not considered problematic. Diana represented the natural world. Hunting was part of that world. She governed both the hunt and the hunted. Diana was a virgin goddess. Like Minerva, she did not marry. She remained independent. Her focus was on the wilderness and the hunt. Domestic life did not interest her. Hunters made offerings to Diana. They asked for success in the hunt. They also thanked her after a successful hunt. The animal killed was, in a sense, a gift from Diana. Acknowledging this was proper. Women also prayed to Diana, especially concerning childbirth. This seems unrelated to hunting, but Diana had this role as well. She helped women through the process of giving birth. The connection may have been through the general association with the natural processes of life. In art, Diana carried a bow and arrows. She wore a short tunic suitable for moving through forests. A deer or hunting dog might be shown with her. These were her companions. The imagery conveyed her nature clearly. Bacchus. Bacchus was the god of wine. Wine was important in Roman culture. It was drunk daily. It was part of religious ceremonies. Having a god who presided over wine was natural. Bacchus was that god. Bacchus was associated with ecstasy and celebration. Wine produces altered states. It loosens inhibitions. It creates a sense of fellowship. These effects were attributed to Bacchus. When people drank together and felt joy, that was Bacchus's influence. Festivals honoring Bacchus involved drinking, dancing, and celebration. These festivals could become quite enthusiastic. The normal social order was temporarily suspended. People behaved in ways they might not ordinarily behave. This was acceptable during Bacchus's festivals. It was part of honoring him. Bacchus was often depicted with a wine cup and grapevines. Sometimes he rode a donkey or a leopard. His followers, called Bacchantes, were shown in states of ecstatic celebration. The imagery captured the energy and abandon associated with his worship. The practical function of Roman religion. Roman religion was practical. The gods existed. They had power. They could help or harm humans. Therefore, it made sense to maintain good relationships with them. This was done through proper worship. Proper worship meant performing the correct rituals at the correct times. It meant making appropriate offerings. It meant showing respect. Romans were not required to love the gods. They were required to honor them correctly. If the rituals were performed properly, the gods would be satisfied. They would grant their favor. If the rituals were neglected, problems might result. Disease, crop failure, military defeat. These could indicate divine disfavor. Therefore, maintaining proper ritual was important. Different gods were invoked for different purposes. If one needed help with a sea voyage, one prayed to Neptune. If one needed help with a harvest, one prayed to Ceres, goddess of agriculture. If one needed help in battle, one prayed to Mars. The system was straightforward. Each god had their domain. One approached the appropriate god for one's need. The myths explained why gods had their particular natures and domains. They explained relationships between gods. They provided stories that made the divine world comprehensible. Romans told these stories. Children learned them. The stories were part of cultural knowledge. They were familiar. They were not questioned. They simply were. Public religious ceremonies occurred regularly. Officials performed sacrifices on behalf of the community. These ceremonies followed established procedures. The procedures were ancient. They were performed as they had always been performed. Tradition was important. Continuity was important. The ceremonies maintained the relationship between Rome and the gods. This relationship sustained Rome's prosperity and power. Private religious practice occurred in homes. Families honored their household gods. They maintained their lararia. They said prayers. They made small offerings. These practices were personal. They concerned the family's well-being. They complemented public religion. Together, public and private religion provided a complete system. Conclusion. The Roman gods were part of Roman life. They were not separate from daily existence. They were woven into it. When a Roman looked at the sky, Jupiter was there. When a Roman went to war, Mars was present. When a Roman fell in love, Venus was involved. When a Roman died, Pluto received them. The gods explained the world. They provided structure. They offered help when properly approached. The stories about the gods were known to everyone. These stories were told and retold. They were carved into monuments. They were painted on walls. They were performed in theatres. They were part of the cultural landscape. A Roman did not need to seek out these stories. They encountered them constantly, simply by living in Roman society. Belief in the gods was assumed. One did not question whether the gods existed. They obviously existed. Their effects were visible. Thunder came from Jupiter. Crops grew through Ceres' blessing. Victory came with Mars's favour. These were observable facts. The gods' existence explained them. This was accepted. Modern people might view these beliefs differently, but for Romans, the gods were simply real. They were part of the furniture of existence. One acknowledged them, one honoured them, one continued with one's life. The gods were there, in the background, constant and present. This was how things were. This was the religious framework within which Roman life proceeded. This concludes the narration.